The young and the restless spoilers. The silence that hovered over the grand estate in Nice was suffocating. Shadows stretched long across the marble floors, and the candlelight flickered as if trembling from the weight of unspoken truths. The echo of a man's scream, feral, raw, and unmistakably anguished, still seemed to vibrate in the air, even though the scene had long since dissolved into chaos. A grainy video clip that leaked from an unknown source had thrown the entire Genoa city elite into a frenzy. In the footage, a man cloaked in black, with gloves tied around his hands, had been seen gripping a knife and shouting into the darkness. He was not just angry, he was murderous. There was no ambiguity in his intention, the blade gleamed with fatal promise, and his scream cut through the stillness like a blade through flesh. It was a moment that shifted the tone of everything. Speculation ran rampant across social media, soap forums, and even the tightly controlled halls of Newman Enterprises and Chancellor Winters. Was the target Victor, the ever-powerful patriarch who had more enemies than allies? Was it Cain, the newly unmasked Aristotle Dumas, whose return had unearthed more secrets than it buried? Or perhaps Damian, whose entanglement with Lily had crossed too many lines? Fans were guessing, theorizing, and connecting invisible threads, but no one knew for sure. All they had was the image of the gloved hand, the flash of the knife, and that haunting scream that still seemed to echo in every corridor of power. But behind the spectacle, hidden from the public eye and gossip columns, Cain stood in his private chamber, trembling. The man once feared as Dumas, the calculating, emotionless mastermind, was no longer the composed figure he had carefully constructed. That version of him had cracked, and now in its place stood a man unraveling at the seams. Tears streamed down his face as he slammed his fist onto the polished mahogany desk. His voice broke in guttural fury. The plan was supposed to be flawless. He had studied Damian's routine, tracked his movements, calculated every moment down to the second. The assassin had been handpicked, cold, ruthless, and discreet. No connection to Genoa City. No reason to talk. But the operation had failed. Not only had Damian survived the attempt, but the attacker had been apprehended. Worse, he hadn't died. He had been taken alive, and now Cain's perfect crime stood on the precipice of exposure. What if he talked? What if he gave names? What if he pointed to Cain and confirmed everything that had been brewing behind closed doors? Cain paced the floor like a caged animal. His breath was ragged, and each inhalation carried the weight of dread. He had risked everything, not just for power, but for vindication. To prove that the world, that Lily, that Victor, had underestimated him. The transformation into Dumas was not just theatrical, it was a rebirth, forged in pain and revenge. But the facade was now crumbling. The assassin's failure was more than just a tactical loss, it was an existential one. For Cain knew something that others didn't, Damian wasn't just lucky. He had been warned. Someone inside the circle had tipped him off. Someone close. That realization slithered through Cain's mind like venom. Who among them had betrayed him? As he gazed into the fireplace, the embers hissing like whispers from ghosts, Cain felt something unfamiliar: fear. Not the kind that comes from a physical threat, but the kind that corrodes from within. If the assassin talked, and the authorities traced the conspiracy back to him, it wouldn't just be the end of his second life as Dumas, it would be the end of everything. Chancellor Winters, the trust he was clawing back from Lily, the tenuous alliance with Amanda, the calculated manipulation of Billy, all would implode. And then there was the chilling thought that maybe, just maybe, Victor already knew. The old man had always been several moves ahead, and if he had suspected Cain's involvement, this entire failure might have been orchestrated. Cain clenched his jaw. Was he being played? Meanwhile, Damian sat under tight security, but not in fear. He was bruised, yes. He bore the physical scars of the attack. But his eyes burned with the fury of a man who had glimpsed death and returned with purpose. He knew Cain had sent the killer. He recognized the signature, cold, indirect, and opportunistic. But Damian had been in too many wars to die like that. And now, with the attacker in custody, he was preparing to fight back. Not with fists, but with precision. Damian knew how to dismantle an empire. And Kane's world would fall, not in a blaze of glory, but piece by piece. All Damian had to do was wait for the assassin to open his mouth. And he would. Everyone broke, eventually. All it took was the right leverage, and Damian had already arranged for that. Elsewhere in Genoa City, the tension was palpable. Victor had received a private briefing about the attack and was watching closely. He had always regarded Kane as a wild card, useful at times, but dangerous when left unchecked. Victor wasn't surprised by the chaos. What intrigued him was the timing. The assassination attempt had come just days after a confidential meeting between Kane and Billy had mysteriously leaked. Was the hit meant to silence Damian before he could expose something deeper? Something tied to Chancellor? Something tied to the covert transactions that were now missing from the financial logs? Victor knew better than to assume coincidences. He also knew Kane had made a mistake. The kind of mistake that Victor Newman never forgot. He had already put Michael on the case, not just to follow the police investigation, but to manipulate it. If Kane was going to burn, Victor wanted front row seats and a hand on the matchstick. And then there was Amanda. Her hands trembled as she read the reports. Her legal mind parsed every detail, every word, every line from the police files. She knew what this meant. If Kane was linked to a murder attempt, every deal she had negotiated for him would be subject to scrutiny. Every shared document, every wire transfer, every confidential discussion would be subpoenaed. And with that would come her own exposure. She wasn't guilty, but in the court of public opinion, proximity was guilt enough. She had known Kane was dangerous, but she believed she could control the chaos, ride the tiger without getting mauled. But now the tiger had turned, and the blood in its mouth was real. As the storm gathered, Lily stood on the edge of the battlefield, watching the fragments of her past collide with the present. She had tried to move on. She had tried to embrace the life she was building with Devon and Chancellor Winters. But the ghost of Kane never truly left. Now he had returned in a form more monstrous than she feared. If the allegations were true, if Kane had tried to kill Damian, it would destroy what little hope remained that he was redeemable. And worse, it would draw her into the line of fire. Reporters were already circling, hungry for quotes, eager for scandal. Her silence was not protection, it was a vacuum waiting to be filled. And still, the question lingered, who was the man in the gloves? Was it a hired gun, or was there more than one player in the shadows? Had someone framed Kane? Could this entire fiasco be a masterstroke from a third party? Someone who wanted both Kane and Damian out of the picture? After all, this was not just a story of vengeance, it was a chessboard, and the pieces were moving faster than anyone anticipated. Back at the holding facility, the man in the gloves sat alone in a cold cell, his fingers twitching, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. Interrogations would begin soon. He had resisted so far, but cracks had already begun to show. His loyalty was not to Kane. It had been bought, and loyalty bought with money always had an expiration date. All it would take was the right amount of pressure. Or the right threat. And then the name Kane Ashby would be on every headline. The fall would be swift, merciless, and permanent. But Kane wasn't done. As the clock ticked and paranoia gripped him tighter, he began drafting contingency plans. Bank accounts were being rerouted. Passports arranged. Alliances tested. But deep inside, he knew he could not outrun the truth forever. What terrified him more than jail was something far worse, irrelevance. Once a man like Kane lost the power to manipulate, to dominate, to matter, he ceased to exist. And if this was the end, he wouldn't go quietly. So, who was the man in gloves? Who screamed into the darkness with a knife in his hand? Was it merely an assassin caught in the wrong moment? Or was it a mirror reflecting the collective rage, desperation, and unraveling minds of Genoa City's most powerful? Perhaps that man wasn't just one person. Perhaps he was a symbol of how far they had all fallen. A manifestation of the chaos that now ruled their lives. And perhaps, just perhaps, the real scream hadn't even happened yet. Because the worst may still be coming. And when it does, no one, not Kane, not Damian, not even Victor, will escape unscathed. The blade had missed its target this time. But the next strike may not. The question pulsed like a siren beneath the surface of every whispered conversation in Genoa City and beyond: who was the real target? The leaked footage had left just enough ambiguity to seed chaos, and that chaos was now blossoming into full-blown hysteria. The man in black gloves, the scream that cut like steel, the glint of the knife, it was visceral, unforgettable, but more than that, it was inconclusive. In a town where power was currency and loyalty changed with the wind, ambiguity wasn't just a narrative tool, it was a weapon. And someone was wielding it expertly. The initial consensus had been simple, almost too simple: Damian was the victim. He had survived the attack. He had bruises, stitches, a near-death story. But now, whispers of an alternate theory were beginning to spread like a virus. What if Damian wasn't the target? What if the true assassination plot had been aimed at Kane all along? What if the entire thing had been staged, a masterful redirection to mask a more sinister agenda? Kane himself was no longer sure of anything. Once a man of chilling certainty, of methodical control, he now lived in a state of suspended fear. The paranoia was no longer hypothetical. He had dismissed the first anonymous threat as nothing more than psychological warfare, Damian trying to rattle him. But the second one, a blood-stained envelope slipped beneath his hotel door containing only 3 words, "You're already dead," shattered that illusion. Kane had felt fear before, but this was different. This was personal. Someone had crossed the threshold from opposition to obliteration. The hunter had become the hunted, and now Kane didn't know which footsteps behind him belonged to a shadow or a killer. He had ramped up security, brought in his own private team, but trust was a dying commodity. Every glance over his shoulder carried weight. Every silence in a hallway felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. And yet, in the chaos, a maddening realization began to take root in his mind: what if he wasn't the only target? What if none of this was about him at all? What if everything, the assassin, the botched attempt, the arrest, the screaming man in gloves, was orchestrated to throw off the scent? To obscure the real play? Damian. It always circled back to Damian. If someone wanted to eliminate Damian, who better to frame than Kane? After all, his motives were public record. The bitterness, the rivalry, the exposed secrets, the jealousy, it all made too much sense. Was Kane being framed? Or worse, was he being used as a decoy in a much more intricate web? But then the story grew darker. Rumors began to emerge that the arrested attacker had gone missing in custody. Official reports said he was being transferred to another facility for security reasons, but no one could confirm his current location. And then came the anonymous message to the press: "The wrong man screamed." That cryptic line sent the entire narrative into a tailspin. If the man in gloves wasn't the attacker, then who was? And more terrifying still, if the attacker was silenced before he could speak, what truth had just been buried? Amanda began to suspect something far more insidious. She had initially defended Kane, believing his innocence, or at least his strategic restraint. But the inconsistencies in the reports, the rapid shifting of narratives, the vague language in the police statements, it all pointed to manipulation. And not just from Kane. Someone else was pulling strings behind the scenes, not to protect Kane, but to orchestrate an elaborate misdirection. Amanda began to fear they were all pieces in a much larger game, one they couldn't see in its entirety. She reopened sealed files, subpoenaed evidence, and began to trace a trail that led not just to Kane or Damian, but to a third name that had been missing from the headlines but present in every shadow. Someone hiding in plain sight. Someone with motive, access, and an unmatched talent for psychological warfare. Victor watched it all unfold with a mixture of contempt and calculation. He knew better than to accept any narrative at face value. The chaos served him, for now. With Kane spiraling, Damian sidelined, and Amanda distracted, Victor had room to maneuver. But he also recognized a disturbing pattern. The framing, the vanishing witness, the staged fear, this wasn't random. It was theatrical. And Victor knew one thing: the more dramatic the performance, the more dangerous the playwright. And still, the central mystery remained unsolved. Who was the man in the gloves? The video had been analyzed by countless tech experts, but the resolution was too poor. The voice had been modulated, the scream filtered. The knife, however, had a very specific curve, custom-made. Victor had seen that curve before, in a private collection stolen years ago from a high-level arms dealer with ties to someone he once crossed paths with in Eastern Europe. The connection was chilling. If that man was in Genoa City now, it meant the storm wasn't over, it was only just beginning. In the quiet corridors of Chancellor Winters, Lily struggled to keep the company from imploding. The board demanded answers. Investors were pulling out. Stock was dropping. And she was caught in the middle of a war between Kane and Damian, one of whom might be a killer, both of whom might be victims. She found herself reliving the past, the lies, the betrayals, the heartbreak. But this was different. This wasn't just emotional warfare. This was blood. And she didn't know how to shield herself. Or her legacy, from the splatter. Meanwhile, Damian moved silently through the night, alive but not unscathed. He knew what fear looked like, but he also knew what vengeance felt like. And he was done waiting. If Kane thought he could escape, he was wrong. If someone else was using them as pawns, Damian was ready to flip the board. He began contacting names from his own past, people not found on LinkedIn or corporate registries. People who could find the man in gloves. People who wouldn't ask questions before making someone disappear. So now we return to the most terrifying question: who was the real victim? Was it Damian, whose survival turned him into a target again? Or was it Kane, spiraling into paranoia, unaware that his death may have already been scheduled? Or was it both, caught in a web spun by someone even darker, someone who thrives in ambiguity, someone who wants them both to bleed? The writers have made a deliberate choice, no doubt. The ambiguity is not a flaw, it is a trap. A narrative puzzle box designed to make every viewer question what they think they know. Because in a world where everyone has secrets and no one is truly innocent, the line between victim and villain dissolves. And that is where the real terror lies. So, how do you feel? Do you still believe Damian was the intended target? Or has the noose always been around Kane's neck, slowly tightening with every breath he takes? What if they're both wrong? What if we all are? What if the person with the knife is someone no one suspects? What if the scream wasn't of fear, but of triumph? As Genoa City sleeps uneasily under its facade of elegance and wealth, one thing is certain: the blade has not yet struck its final blow. The scream we heard was just a prelude. And when the true victim falls, it will shake the foundations of every family, every empire, every lie that has kept this city standing. Stay alert. The killer is not done yet. And neither is the story.